Hi, everyone. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the second in our special Benjamin and Barbara Zucker lecture series devoted to exploring the connections, but also the divergences between antisemitism and other forms of racism and prejudice. I'm really happy to introduce today's speaker, Cathy Park Hong. She holds degrees from Oberlin and the University of Iowa and is currently professor of creative writing at Rutgers, Newark. Considered one of America's most innovative poets, she's the author of 3 collections of poetry, including Dance Dance Revolution, which was chosen by Adrienne Rich for the Barnard Women Poets Prize. Among her many other honors, I'll mention just the Guggenheim Fellowship, the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and Yale's own Wyndham Campbell Prize. Many of you no doubt remember her electrifying lectures on campus when she received that prize in 2018. Today, though, we're here to talk about Cathy Park Hong's most recent book of creative nonfiction, Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning. This book was released last February and has received what can only be called a passionate response in the press. Writing in The New Yorker, the critic Gia Tolentino said, Cathy Park Hong's book of essays bled a dormant discomfort out of me with surgical precision. Claudia Rankin said, to read this book is to become more human. So the plan for today is that I'm going to engage Cathy in discussion for about a half an hour, and then I'll ask her questions from the audience. So please submit your questions to me at any time during the discussion using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The chat function is disabled and audience members will remain otherwise muted. So now please join me in welcoming Cathy Park Hong. Hi, Cathy. Unmute yourself.
Oh,
great. Okay. Well, welcome. So let me just say that I just thought this book was totally amazing. It's so smart, so brave, and I think it's really an important book, especially right now, as we engage in this kind of collective conversation about racism in the US. So thank you so much for being here.
thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really happy to, be present and talk to everyone at Yale here.
Terrific. Okay, well, let's dive in. So my first question, you begin with an excruciating but also hilarious story of getting rejected by and then kind of stalking a Korean therapist when you were depressed. So you were sure that she would understand all your issues because she was Korean, and then you couldn't believe it when she didn't want to take you on as a client, maybe because of the dozens of voicemails that you left on her machine. So this story immediately made me think I was going to love the book, but I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about why you chose to put this kind of painful anecdote right at the beginning.
Probably because it was an excruciating experience. It's both kind of absurd and rather abject, and I think really I wanted to, maybe I started with that anecdote because I also wanted to disarm the reader, so like, I think like perhaps in like a, maybe a more conventional kind of memoir nonfiction book, there's an encounter with a therapist, and especially if it's a therapist of the same culture, the same cultural background, there's a kind of kinship that's kindled, and and then the retelling and the talking cure begins. And instead in my anecdote, the therapist just slams the door in my face, this where I was expecting this kind of shared kinship, and there's a Korean word for it, chung. Instead, she just flat out rejects me, which I was so insulted and hurt by at the time, but in retrospect, I also find it kind of funny. And so it kind of gave me a bit of a glee to begin with, that to disarm the reader on what this book was going to be. And, also to show that my, the persona, it's also, I would say that myself in the book is kind of persona is not exactly going to be this nice, neutral person. Maybe, but besides from disarming the reader, I think I also wanted to, so much of the book is about my interiority and being public about my interiority. And there is a lot of passages about mental health, and which is still very taboo among many Asian Americans. And so so it seemed appropriate to begin with my attempt, at least, to find a therapist. And, and also in the book, I talk about how finding a Korean therapist, I wanted to find a Korean American therapist because I didn't have to explain myself as much. The therapist would just look at me and know what I was talking about. And then I talk about how I had to explain myself. And this was sort of my own kind of reckoning was, which I resisted as a poet, was to kind of explain myself to myself, and explain myself to people and, to others in my community or my family, my friends, and so to speak. And, and for so long, I also resisted writing this kind of book, the kind of book about Asian American identity. And I was like, well, okay, if I'm going to really do it, I'm going to really dive into it and just explain myself, but not to a white audience, explain myself to more to people who share what I've been through. More that, of course, it's for everyone, but I
Yeah,
think those were the people I had in mind at first.
right. And I would note that it was actually a Jewish therapist who actually you wound up seeing.
I know. Our friend, we have a mutual friend, Gita, and she read an early draft of the book, and then when she saw when I said I happened to find a Jewish therapist, she found that to be the funniest. She found that to be hilarious, and she's still my therapist. She's amazing.
Well, this actually leads me to my next question, which is that I feel like there are many overlaps between the Korean or the Asian American experience and the Jewish American experience that I wasn't even aware of until I read your book. But one of the big ones, I think, is this idea of self-hatred. And you describe, there's a very funny passage, you describe wondering who let in all the Asians when you find yourself in a room with other Asians. And it, of course, made me think of Groucho Marx's famous line about not wanting to join a club that would have him as a member. So I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about self-hatred and about how internalized prejudice manifests itself for you or for minorities in general.
I mean, I will say that writing this book, there is like a rich tradition of Jewish writers and also Black writers who write about their self-hatred in ways that are both full of rage, but also funny and neurotic. And so those are definitely like the kind of models that I was like thinking about in writing about this. But I think like, yeah, no, I mean, it's hard because you grow up with it. And I think like what's very canny about living in a white dominant society or a white supremacist society is that world, I would say, is that it creates divisions, is the divisions that it creates, not between races, between ethnic groups within races, and also divisions within within people in ethnic groups, within your family, and also within yourself. And because to form any kind of coalition would be a threat to those who hold power. And that is, that's probably something that we're all kind of abstractly aware of, but it's really insidious when it works, when it just, it starts when you're very young, you know, and then it's like it's drilled into you, and it's hard to kind of separate yourself from that sensibility. You know, where I grew up in LA, and you know, my family spent a lot of time in Koreatown. It's not like I grew up, you know, in like Wichita or anything. Um, but I went to school, you know, I went to high school that was very white. And, you know, and I also lived in a neighborhood later on that was also quite white. And, you know, or even like visiting, I remember like visiting Orange County, which has changed a lot since I was a kid. But back then it was super racist. I mean, really just blatantly racist. And, you know, and I'd be hanging out with my cousins, and you know, and the white kids would say, oh, look, there's a Korean parade. And I think like so from very early on, I knew that like being with among other Koreans or other Asians was to invite ridicule, because we were making ourselves conspicuous. We were just there. We were, you know, and it was the same for any other marginalized group. You know, there were, you know, if you're thinking about Orange County again, like back then, Mexican Americans were considered dirty Mexicans if they, you know, went to beaches or certain pools, because they were kind of infecting the waters, you know. And of course, Black Americans were kind of, are there are too many of them, they're considered intimidating, threatening, and so forth. But I think for Asians, it was more ridicule, you know, like, and you still see that, like, if you see like groups of Asian tourists, you know, there's this sort of, people tend to mock Asians and so forth. And, you know, even at the high school, the Asians were very self-aware of that. And, you know, there was a group where they called themselves the Asian invasion. And I think there's a, you know, which is like, yes, it was sort of making fun of it, and also maybe like just taking it and sort of reversing it and be like, you know, and yes, we're the invasion, so what are you going to do about it? But I think that Asian invasion is, with that nice little rhyme, is really just that kind of encapsulates the threat that we pose as a collective, and that we will invade, you know, institutions, or you know, positions of power, or you know, I guess like most you know, the examples that we find most often in media are schools, right? You know, there's this very kind of corporatized, institutionalized notion of diversity, where it's fine as long as the majority is still pretty white, and then you have samplings from other racial groups. But if you have too many Black people, too many Latinx people, too many Asians, then we're a threat. So that's what was happening with, say, Harvard, right? Because, and there was that discrimination case because there were too many Asians. And of course, there's that Jewish corollary too. You know,
I was just, yeah, listening to you. I mean, that, you know, Jews face a very similar thing, you know, and, you know, starting in the 1920s, that's when they started having quotas, because all of a sudden there were so many Jewish students who, you know, started to do well on the tests. And in fact, it was supposedly, that's when they started to, you know, create the holistic, you know, kind of approach to admissions, and sort of start grading on character and all these things as a way to exclude Jews. And that's being deployed often again, you know.
Yeah, definitely. It's like the kind of well-rounded individual. And like, you know, what's the subtext of that is that like Asian Americans are robotic, only interested in math, and so forth. And so it's, you know, it's, so I think it's like it's this kind of colonized condition where you just sort of, where we believe it too, where if you're with other people who look like you know, you lose your personhood, your subjectivity. And so it's better to be separate, that you don't do that, you know, rather than collect, you know, forming, having solidarity, and feeling proud that you're with other people who share your culture. So yeah, it's a big issue.
And a kind of related point is and another thing that I think links the kind of Jewish American experience and Asian American experience is the model minority myth.
Mhm.
You know, so this idea, which you brilliantly deconstruct in the book, that Asians are expected not to complain because some of them are doing economically pretty well, or are even next in line to become white, as someone says to you in the book. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that model minority myth, and whose interests it serves and how it affects members of the minority group.
Oh, I mean, I think it ultimately serves white people, but you know, or just maybe not white people, but more just sort of the kind of racial hierarchy that we live in currently. But I'm not gonna lie, it also benefits Asians too, in certain ways, uh but I mean, I go into it in the book, and I think anyone who's even just have the most superficial understanding of Asian American history know that Asians were used as a counterexample to the civil rights movement, or where we weren't uppity, and we weren't gonna and that's we weren't uppity, and that we weren't gonna ask for government handouts, or we work hard, and and it's carried on the 80s and 90s. There's like Reagan's notion of the welfare queen, and the welfare mother, and and Asian Americans were those who again just worked hard, and didn't work diligently, and through grit got their kids into universities and lived the American dream. And as I said in the book, a lot of that's also fallacious, because Asians who ended up coming to the country were like it was a quota. It was only the most highly educated Asians who were allowed in, who were Asians who were already engineers, doctors, and so forth. And in fact, I just want to add, like, actually, at least among Koreans, the ones who were engineers and doctors and so forth came in, and they actually were downwardly mobile. They came in as doctors, but they couldn't get the jobs because they were Asian immigrants. So a lot of them ended up working at a deli or driving cabs and so forth. So that's so I just want to kind of uh, add that. So it's always served white Americans because we were used as this kind of wedge. And so it was, and also I want to say that, like, it's very important to remember that our status is conditional. And we have seen that with Muslims in right after 9/11. We're seeing that with those who are East Asian after during COVID. And I use example in the book about my friend Prageeta Sharma, whose father was president of was the first South Asian president, I think, for a small university. And then once he became president, he became a target of a lot of these racist attacks, because what I emphasize in the book is that once you actually gain power, the model minority myth that helped you is turned against you, because it being assimilated is not the same thing as having power. And he had power, and so he needed to be taken down. And then Prageeta Sharma, who was also a director at a university program, was just basically shat on by her white colleagues. And I mean, it was just appalling, but also not surprising. However, I think there are also Asians, of course, who benefit, older Asian Americans who, I have my mother's friends. Some of my mother's friends are voting for Trump, because they don't want high taxes, or because they think their stocks are doing well, and and who cares about the rest of America. And then they're also, but for me, like, actually the most, I hope that this book reaches out to, um, the Asian Americans who were like born here, who are younger, who have thrived and benefited from neoliberal America. Those who work for Facebook or Goldman Sachs, or who work as hedge funders, many of whom who think they're completely untouched by the racial hierarchy,
Mhm.
and don't think and equate a good neighborhood with a white neighborhood. I hope to reach out to them because I think they're the ones who are actually adjacent to power. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so it helps Asians too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting and you as you point out in the book and said, it's there's so Asians have the highest income disparity of any minority group. So in fact, there are so many really poor Asians, and it must be so
Exactly.
appalling to
Well,
hear.
that's, I mean, those are the, I mean, that's where the model minority myth is actually really quite damaging, is that there is a huge disparity, like where you have, you know, Chinese, Hindu, Indian, Japanese Americans who are elite, but who are on the highest income bracket. But then you have, those who are Southeast Asian, who are on the lowest economic bracket. So it's like the model minority myth, of course, completely ignores and erases, uh, say the Hmong community in Minnesota, who have really, really struggled, or
Yeah.
the Cambodians, or in California. It's a big issue.
So, I'm sure many people have asked you about this title, Minor Feelings. And, you describe minor feelings in the book as, I'm quoting, the racialized range of emotions that are negative, dysphoric, built from the sediments of everyday racial experience and the irritant of having one's perception of reality constantly questioned or dismissed. And you cite scholars and writers like Claudia Rankin as inspirations in your elaborations of the concept. But I'm wondering, what is specifically Asian American about, or what is specifically Asian about minor feelings? Is there something, or does it apply to all, minority groups?
I think it's like a flexible kind of affect, that I was also borrowing from other theorists like Sienna and Lauren Berlant and so forth. So, and I do think that it can apply to many marginalized groups where, I mean, where they have these minor feelings that living in sort of a capitalist racist system that promises social mobility without actually delivering it to you. So when you feel stuck, you think the onus is on you, that it's your fault, rather than thinking that it's structural. But yes, I think it's also very particular. You could say it's a condition that I think is and I have found after the book was published that it really did speak to a lot of Asian Americans who read the book. I was like, oh, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. But um, I, I think what's Asian American about it is, which may make it different than, which differentiates it from, say, other racial groups, is this condition of being chronically overlooked, demonetized. Um, and like Asians, for instance, are still not even named when in the polls, when there are racial breakdowns. We're still other, because there's not enough of us, or we're just like not, too many of us live in California, so what's the point? uh, but it's not just from the country. I think for a lot of us, it also comes from the home too, where your whatever you're experiencing, your perception of reality is demonetized, overlooked, not just by America, but from your family too, because there's this real kind of, perhaps not all, but for some, second generation, first generation uh, conflict, where parents probably have more of a survivalist kind of survivor uh, uh, way of looking at things, versus this sense of alienation that younger Asian Americans have. And I think so. There's this constant. I felt this, that my rage or my melancholy or my questions weren't worthy enough to address, and weren't worthy enough to make public, because of how I grew up, because they weren't uh, representations of me in media, but that's not the only reason. And I think it's even within the rubric of racial politics. I have heard a lot of Asians say, well, like I have, I had a student who said, when there was a lot of anti-Asian racism during COVID, she's like, oh, I didn't think it was right for me. I mean, I was talking to my Black friend, and I didn't think it was right for me to express my experiences of xenophobia and inequality. And I think there's this kind of shame or sense of insufficiency, or, where it's like, I don't, where they think their oppression is not as extreme as Black or Indigenous people. So there's this kind of automatic internalized belittling, or even self-gaslighting or trivializing of our own concerns. And, this is why I wrote this book, because I think it's really, we can't play this game of oppression Olympics, and, in order to fight injustice, you have to acknowledge and, and reckon with, and embrace your own life story and what you had to go through in order to kind of have an allianceship with other racial groups. If you kind of deny yours, or deny that kind of minor feelings from other people like you, then I don't think anything can really be done. I think it's very important. I mean, sorry, I'm going on a little bit, but I see some Asian Americans who say, like, to call out other Asian Americans as, you're being anti-Black, stop being so anti-Black. And I'm like, I don't think scolding is going to work. I think you need to first talk about reconciling with what you went through, that you have been taught to deny and suppress, and open that up. And only through opening up your vulnerability, will you really be able to fight for a more equitable country.
And I think that's what Gia Tolentino, I imagine she meant, that you kind of you point throughout the book, I think, to these feelings that, people, not just Asians, I think this was really valid for all minority groups, but, these sensations and things that you've thought of but didn't know were a thing, kind of, and I think by articulating that, you just do a huge service to people. So I want to encourage people to please send me questions in the Q&A. I have a lot more questions, so I'll keep going, but please do send me your questions, and I'll start asking them in a minute. But I wanted to pick up on that question of the relationship between Asians and Blacks. And you have one of the most painful sections of the book is your description of the Rodney King riots in LA in the early 90s, and of the tensions, especially between Koreans and Korean Americans and Black people in that moment. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about where you see Asians fitting in to the American racial system today, and especially at this moment of kind of renewed debate and questioning of those hierarchies.
Oh, it's very complex, and I think that there isn't enough discourse between minorities about reconcile or just addressing the anti-Blackness within our communities. Make no mistake, a lot of Asians are anti-Black. Now, granted, this is more older Asian Americans. I think there's been a real sea change, which I find to be really gratifying, actually, I have to say. And maybe this is just like the people that I am exposed to, but I will say, just from experience, Asian Americans are, at least like millennials, Gen Z are, and maybe some Gen X, are much more galvanized, much more activist, much more aware and woke, I guess is the term, to racial politics in this country, and really trying to fight the kind of the colorism and the racism within their communities. I think we've gone a far way. We've come a far way far since the LA riots, when there was this kind of conflict between Koreans and Black Americans, and yet we still have far to go. And I think the LA riots, a lot of people have forgotten the LA riots, but I think it's still there. I mean, the wounds have not healed. I think like when a lot of African Americans think about relations with Black Asian relations, they bring up the LA riots a lot, and about like how we were just we're hostile to the Black community, and it's a lot of work that we need to do. But I think it's also tricky for Asian Americans, because it's like we're both, as I said in the book, we're in this purgatorial position where we are, we're both oppressors in a way, but we're also oppressed. And a lot of the ways in which we are oppressed are never, they're not seen ever, so.
And I feel like that's a real parallel with the Jewish American experience, especially historically. Like early 20th century, many Jews were kind of forced because of prejudice into an economic niche where they were dealing with minority groups, and it wasn't always rosy. And and there's it's just complicated levels of racism that go into those relations. So I think you really do a great job in, I think, being honestly confronting that as a way to move beyond it. So here's a question from we have a couple questions from the listeners. So one is, if you could talk a little bit about your research process writing the book. This questioner was really struck by the way you were able to blend and contextualize your own experiences both with history and with writers before you. And so you, especially Asian writers, who you do a great job bringing attention to in the book.
It was really like writing the book I have to say I was a little blindfolded, because just kind of just working on the book, because I've never written nonfiction. I mean, I've written the reviews and a couple essays previously, and I guess I did have some experience reporting, but like I've never really written. I'm a poet, and I never written a book of nonfiction before. So it was that, and also I wasn't really sure if any of the essays were going to come together. So it was actually really kind of terrifying to write this book, because it was all really uncharted territory for me. So it wasn't like I had this like outline of what the book was going to be like, and I had like these set of concerns that I was going to research. What I did was I just kind of followed my obsessions. I followed what I what I felt compelled by, my compulsions. So like I was and I just hoped that my obsessions would just kind of would just all kind of neatly come together. So I began because I wasn't thinking I'm going to write a book about the Asian American condition. I did not think that. It was originally going to be a book. When I conceived it as a book of essays, I was like, it was vaguer than that. It was about race and institutional racism in the arts, portrait of an artist, my experience as a poet. And it was just sort of these kind of vague ideas that I had. And with each chapter, it was a subject that I just couldn't stop thinking about. So we know with this book, I began with the friendship essay, which had maybe less research and more to do with just kind of really going back to that time and remembering. And then, and then I was, and the Richard Pryor was also, me researching stand-up comedy and watching a lot of stand-up and watching a lot of Richard Pryor, which I researched that I had already done before working on this book, because I was already obsessed with Richard Pryor and had all of this transcribed material during a period where I had writer's block, and I was like, all right, I'm just going to transcribe Richard Pryor as if I was going to be his apprentice or something. And I just didn't know what to do with it. Like, I had all of this sort of research on comedy and Richard Pryor, and I was like, maybe I could turn it into poetry or something. And instead it just ended up becoming this essay.
Mm-hmm.
And then Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha was another kind of obsession that I had. And I began, I didn't actually want to work on that. I didn't want to do it, actually. I was like, this is too hard.
It's a very painful episode in the book. I mean, for those who haven't read it, I don't know if you want to just say.
Yeah, it's an essay about this poet artist, Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha, who was raped and murdered in New York City in the early 80s. And I was, really influenced by her book Dictee when I was in college, and have always been influenced by her since then. And what I discovered was, that no one has written about her rape and murder. So the book is, the essay is, it's kind of like a true crime essay, but it's also just more an investigation about why this silence, why no one wrote about it, both among Asian Americans and scholars, and also media at the time, and so forth. And it was me kind of digging into that silence and also kind of giving myself permission to write about it. But I didn't want to write about it at first, because it was like, I was like, this is too a depressing of a subject, and I feel weird writing about it, since like maybe the family doesn't want to talk about it. And it wasn't fun to write, but I just felt compelled. I had to write it, so like I had these several essays, and then I just started realizing, like, the kind of threads started becoming visible. It was like art making, capitalism, of course, Asian American identity, and so forth. And then I started kind of shaping the essay so that they really had more to do with, that they kind of had more of a through line. But I think when I was researching, I was researching each essay individually. Yeah.
And you can really feel like you called it a compulsion, and I think you can really feel that in the book, that these things you're writing about them because you can't not write about them, in a sense.
Yeah.
So this actually relates to another question from someone in the audience, which is that in the book you speak directly about many sensitive topics like suicide, but I would add also rape and murder. So how do you navigate the boundary between processing and re-traumatization in how you talk about certain incidents? And I think the suicide, there's also, I'm thinking of the friendship chapter where you're talking about your two friends in college, and one of whom turns out to have like pretty serious addiction and mental health issues. And so anyway, if you could say a little bit about how you navigate that boundary.
I think part of it is by being as self-aware as possible and as considerate as possible, and asking asking myself as many questions as I'm writing about it. I don't know if I'm interpreting your term re-traumatization, because I'm wondering, is it re-traumatizing the reader?
Someone asking from the audience, so I don't know exactly what she meant, but I think what she means is by writing about this, are you I don't know if she's talking about re-traumatizing in the person who might read it, or anyone who has experienced a similar thing who might get triggered and therefore re-traumatize.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, that was always on my mind, I was like, and also in the book, I say, not only that, I say, I also criticize narratives of trauma. Like, who does this really benefit? Is it really is it going to really also, uh, is it edifying, or does empowering for the person, for the group who have this collective trauma, or is this for the white audience? So I mean, so this is like, and I'm like, am I doing the same thing by writing about rape and suicide and murder? And but I think also, and maybe this is an easy out, but I also say, like, I think writing about any racial condition is going to be full of contradictions, and you just have to be open to it. Um, I think part of it was being very aware, but I also had to push forward with it because, um, like the case of Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha, the reason why no one wrote about it was because of this fear of re-traumatization. And I also talk about this, right? In the essay about Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha, where I say, uh, at least in certain communities, the Asian American community, there's such a, not to prioritize Western thinking or something, but like, um, when in but in psychoanalysis, uh, the whole kind of basic tenet of the talking cure is that once you talk about it, it no longer afflicts you, right? It's no longer something that uh, you feel subconsciously oppressed by. Whereas what the kind, within my family, the kind of family I grew up in, you couldn't talk about your pain, because if you did, you not only re-traumatized yourself, but you re-traumatized everyone around you. You re-traumatized your mother, your father, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And also there was this element of shame, right? That if by talking about, um, let's say, being sexually assaulted or something,
Mm-hmm.
then I was bringing shame by saying it aloud. And I really needed to push against that, because I think it's still, that kind of culture is still very strong. And at the risk of re-traumatizing, I think re-traumatizing can, the fear of re-traumatizing someone can also be very, very silencing, and can be even more damaging than helpful.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So, another question from an audience member about genre. So, what genre do you consider the book to be? Because you've incorporated the words of other artists, your own personal life, Asian American history. It's not a typical memoir autobiography. And I would just add to that, what did your editor say? So did your editor like know what you were going to deliver, and did they try to push you to write some more like conventional autobiography? No. Okay. So.
No, I had it. Well, actually, yes, actually, yes. Um, I had a great editor. I was fortunate to have an editor, uh, an Asian American editor, Victoria Matsui. Victoria's half Japanese, gender non-binary, and they were really very tough and very good. And they didn't want me to write anything conventional. I was very fortunate. No one did. Not my agent or my editor or the editor I had after Victory. Um, and I think that I didn't really care that it stuck to any kind of, I didn't want to write a memoir. I didn't want to write a history book. I didn't want to write, a self-help book, I wasn't thinking about that. I was like, I wanted to, I think I just instinctively interdisciplinary, that's how I always was as a poet, where I like was not interested in just writing verse poetry. I wanted to write uh, prose poems, and I would uh, play with science fiction genres and stuff. and it was the same with nonfiction. Like for me, it was more interesting to write about my experience using, you know, a variety of genres, you know, because I needed that. I needed those different systems of knowledge to make my argument clear. And you know, Victory was encouraging of that. I would say in the beginning, in earlier drafts, the book was more, a little bit more academic, you know, a little bit more critical, more impersonal. And so actually Victory did pressure me, I mean, encourage me to be more personal and more autobiographical. And I think it was more for sort of the reader's experience, but I'm glad that Victory did, because I thought like by making it more personal, there was more at stake. And I think the book is much more valuable to me, and I hope valuable to readers because of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I could see that, I could, you know, see those traces of the academic, you know, you've read your critical race theory and it shows, but you're not just rehashing that, you know, and I think that's really important. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I had to write a book that was very much me, you know, I mean, and it was, and where I was coming from, which is I come from a poetry background. I read, you know, critical race theory, but not as a scholar, you know, it's not a scholarly book either. And I read, you know, history, I read randomly. And so it's going to be a book that is an assemblage of those my random reading habits. And it's interesting, like when this book ended up on like in the summer, ended up on some anti-racist reading list, and I was really glad that people were reading it you know, alongside Ibram Kendi and you know, um, and you know, and Ta-Nehisi Coates and all those incredible writers. But I was like, this is a idiosyncratic book. It's not, you know, you know, I think some readers had problems with that, who were expecting more of a kind of broader kind of overview on Asian American history, or kind of like a sort of a or Robin DiAngelo's like self-help, what do you do? And I'm like, that's not it was going to be a strange little book, and it still is, you know. It's not and it's like and a lot of it is just my personal experiences that clearly does not conform to whatever the broad Asian American experience is.
So here's a question. I'm interested in how this book relates to your day job as a poet and a professor of creative writing. You know, so how have you negotiated writing about racial issues in the past? You talk about it in the book, but maybe you can say something. And also, what you don't really say in the book is like, has this changed your poetry now? Like, have you gone back and, you know, started writing poetry again? And is it any different for having written this book?
I haven't been writing that much poetry. I guess when you go prose, you don't go back. No, I'm just kidding. I think I have been writing some poems. I think you know, when I was writing poetry, it was much more, it wasn't autobiographical. It was more, I wrote poetry like a fiction writer. You know, I had lots of different characters and invented worlds. It was a lot of world building. And I think after writing Minor Feelings, it's opened me up. I'm much more, I think I'm much more inclined to write from an autobiographical perspective, and to be very transparent about my thoughts and my life. And so I think that has definitely affected what I've been writing so far, which is both poetry, some poetry and prose, where I've been comfortable in the eye of Minor Feelings that I've continued on with. But I think I'm also more interested in writing about other people's lives, you know, and so I think in that way it's kind of a pivot too, where it's less perhaps focused on me and my ideas about this country, my perspective on this country and what I'm reading, and my personal life, and more pivot to other people's lives.
Mm-hmm. So someone in the audience wants to know if you would comment at all on the college admissions lawsuits, that Yale is now facing, and are raised by questions of, Asian American quotas and things like that. My understanding is that, in fact, most Asian groups on campus have been supportive of affirmative action. But I'm wondering if, you have any comment on how, where that puts Asian Americans and the debate within the Asian American community about that.
What's the update on, I haven't been following.
They're now, bringing a lawsuit, against Yale now. And, it seems to me like with the new Supreme Court, they're liable to throw out affirmative action. I don't know, but, so it was defeated with Harvard, but there's another one that's coming up to Yale, and I'm sure they're going to keep pushing.
Oh, well, I'm all for affirmative action, and I think that's horrifying that we would, Asian Americans would enable the kind of federal overthrowing of affirmative action. And I think we need to stop that. That's not right. And I think, it's hard. It's, again, this is another kind of balancing act, right? Because it's like, we need affirmative action. Asian Americans have benefited from affirmative action. You cannot deny that. I have benefited from affirmative action. I mean, like, I was like listening to Young Jean Lee, this playwright, wrote this op-ed for the New York Times, and she was saying, as a playwright, I became successful. I think she's doing herself a disservice, but she became successful because she's very talented. But she's like, I became successful because of affirmative action. There were no other Asian Americans around, and it's like, and also we came to this country because of the civil rights movement, because, the civil rights movement was making America look bad and look like racist and xenophobic. And so that was part of the reason why they opened their doors in 1965. So we are part of that legacy. And for us to kind of, to undermine that and to kind of, just overthrow affirmative action is just a betrayal. I think it's a betrayal, a real betrayal of what we're doing. And it's a prime example of how we are used as a wedge, first of all. And also how
Americans who are bringing the lawsuit, it's just being done, in the name of the, so it's definitely, they're being used in this sense.
We're being used.
Yeah.
Definitely, and we are being used. We're being used as a pawn. And Asian Americans need to fight against that. Really fight against this, because I think I've had enough. We Asian Americans have to say enough. We will not be used as pawns for white supremacy. And also, but I also am understanding of the fact that there has been a lot of discrimination, and that, that we are, that Asian Americans our subjectivities are not recognized. Mm-hmm. By getting rid of affirmative action is not the answer. I mean, of course, what needs to be addressed is class more than anything, and what needs to be addressed is like the legacy as affirmative action. And I don't know, I don't have the numbers, but like, let's look at the racial demographic of the legacy, the kids who are legacy, or like Jared Kushner, it being a very good example of that.
Right, or athletic recruits, for sports like sailing, and I have nothing against people who sail, but that is affirmative action for rich people.
Right, affirmative action to rich people, and I just saw that one sort of graph where there was SAT scores are proportional to family income. So if your family income was like $200,000 or more, then you had the highest SAT scores, and then it just went down from that and everything. That's what needs to be addressed. We are looking somewhere else. By taking this to the Supreme Court is only enabling this racial hierarchy that we're already in.
Yeah. So here's, I think, probably our last question from the audience. So you write about in the book being kind of opposed to writing about Asian American identity issues, but of course the whole book is about that. So what led you to finally change your mind about writing about Asian American identity? And which actually links up with the last question I had kind of wanted to ask you, which is, have you changed your thoughts on saying we in the book? You write about, you have a hard time talking collectively in a collective voice about Asian Americans, and I'm wondering if that changed for you.
I think it did. I think I've been very heartened by, I'm really happy. I was afraid for about this book coming out. I was afraid that no one would read it, no one would care. And because it's about Asian American identity and it's kind of a muted subject. I don't think that, but I think that's how it's treated, approached. Um, and I've been really, really heartened by the the sheer number of readers who have told me that they've felt seen and that they recognize themselves in their book. And it's not just East Asians. It's a lot of East Asians. It's also a lot of people from other Asian American demographic and also non-Asian minorities too. And so I guess I feel more emboldened to say we, but I would still have the caveat there. I think what's really important to understand is that there are some, there was this one reviewer who was saying, well, she doesn't really was dissatisfied with the book because I don't really talk about what the Asian American experience is. I just talk about sort of our relations to white supremacy and, and our fraught relationship with African Americans. But they're like, but what is Asian American experience? And I'm like, I can't answer that question. It's not, Asian America is a coalition of different nationalities. And and so what I'm trying to, I guess what I wrote that book to say, look, let's embrace the fact that we are a coalition, and that as a coalition, we need to kind of also try to make bridges with other people of color or people who are marginalized, and to build upon those coalitions to fight what this country has become now. The fallen empire that is America. I can't tell you what the Asian American experience is. I can only tell you the book is my own perspective on both the Asian American experience and also my perspective as an Asian American woman on this country. That was always the thesis of the book. And to answer the person's question, I think I always wrote about race, and it was something that I was interested in for a long time, to write a book about Asian American identity. I think it was just because I felt so uncomfortable about it. And, I like to make my life hard by, I'm like a moth to a flame. I like to kind of write about what I'm scared of and what I feel uncomfortable about, because I'm like, oh, well, what is there? Why do I feel uncomfortable? But I think, I've told, said this in many interviews. It's also because I became a mother. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what kind of country do I want my daughter to live in? I don't want her to have the same kind of internalized racism that I had when I was a child. I want to protect her from that. I want her to walk freely, in this world. And so that wrote a book that I hoped was a step towards that world.
Well, that's a great answer. And unfortunately, we are out of time. I feel like we could go on talking all day. Luckily, we know each other and I can keep asking you all the questions that I didn't get to ask you. But for those of you who unfortunately don't know you, I think that, I just really advise that you get a hold of a copy as soon as possible and read the book. So Cathy, thank you so much for talking to us. This was a fantastic gift to us and to the Yale community, and I'm really grateful. So good luck with everything, and thank you.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure. Thank you, Maury, and I hope we get to talk more later.
Terrific. Thank
Mhm.
you.